Chapter 7 La Kajira. The wagon of Kutatuchik, called Ubar of the Tuchuks, was drawn up on a large, flat-topped grassy hill, the highest land in the camp. Beside the wagon, on a great pole fixed in the earth, stood the Tuchuk standard of the four Bosk horns. The 100, rather than 8, Bosk that drew his wagon had been unyoked. They were huge red Bosk. Their horns had been polished, and their coats glistened from the comb and oils. Their golden nose rings were set with jewels. Necklaces of precious stones hung from their polished horns. The wagon itself was the largest in the camp, and the largest wagon I had conceived possible. Actually, it was a vast platform, set on numerous wheeled frames, though at the edges of the platform, on each side, there were a dozen of the large wheels, such as were found on the much smaller wagons. These latter wheels turned as the wagon moved and supported weight, but could not of themselves have supported the entire weight of the fantastic wheeled palace of hide. The hides that formed the dome were of 1,000 colors, and the smoke hole at the top must have stood more than 100 feet from the flooring of the vast platform. I could well conjecture the riches, the loot, and the furnishing that would dazzle the interior of such a magnificent dwelling. But I did not enter the wagon, for Kutatuchik held his court outside the wagon, in the open air, on the flat-topped grassy hill. A large dais had been built, vast and spreading, but standing no more than a foot from the earth. This dais was covered with dozens of thick rugs, sometimes 4 and 5 deep. There were many tuchuks, and some others crowded about the dais, and standing upon it, about Kutatuchik, there were several men who, from their position on the dais and their trappings, I judged to be of great importance. Among these men, sitting cross-legged, was Kutatuchik, called Ubar of the Tuchuks. About Kutatuchik there were piled various goods, mostly vessels of precious metal, and strings and piles of jewels. There was silk there from Teos, silver from Thentis and Tharna, tapestries from the mills of Ar, wines from Kos, dates from the city of Tor. There were also among the other goods 2 girls, blonde and blue-eyed, unclothed and chained. They had perhaps been a gift to Kutatuchik, or had been the daughters of enemies. They might have been from any city. Both were beautiful. One was sitting with her knees tucked under her chin, her hands clasping her ankles, absently staring at the jewels about her feet. The other lay indolently on her side, incuriously regarding us, her weight on one elbow. There was a yellow stain about her mouth where she had been fed some fruit. Both girls wore the sirik, a light chain famed for female slaves by many Gurian masters. It consists of a turn-type collar, a loose round circle of steel, to which a light, gleaming chain is attached. Should the girl stand, the chain, dangling from her collar, falls to the floor. It is about 10 or 12 inches longer than is required to reach from her collar to her ankles. To this chain, at the natural fall of her wrists, is attached a pair of slave bracelets. At the end of the chain there is attached another device, a set of linked ankle rings, which when closed about her ankles lifts a portion of the slack chain from the floor. The sirik is an incredibly graceful thing, and designed to enhance the beauty of its wearer. Perhaps it should be only added that the slave bracelets and the ankle rings may be removed from the chain and used separately. This also, of course, permits the sirik to function as a slave leash. At the edge of the dais, Kamchuk and I had stopped, where our sandals were removed and our feet washed by Turin slaves, men in the Kess, who might once have been officers of their city. We mounted the dais and approached the seemingly somnolent figure seated upon it. Although the dais was resplendent, and the rugs upon it even more resplendent, I saw that beneath Kutatuchik, over these rugs, had been spread a simple, worn, tattered robe of grey bosk hide. It was upon this simple robe that he sat. It was undoubtedly that of which Kamchok had spoken, the robe upon which sits the Ubar of the Tuchuks, that simple robe which is his throne. Kutatuchik lifted his head and regarded us. His eyes seemed sleepy. He was bald, save for a black knot of hair that emerged from the back of his shaven skull. He was a broad-backed man with small legs, and his eyes bore the epicenthic fold, his skin tinged yellowish brown. Though he was stripped to the waist, he was about his shoulders a rich ornamental robe of the red bosk, bordered with jewels. About his neck, on a chain decorated with sleen teeth, were hung a golden medallion bearing the sign of the four bosk horns. He wore furred boots, wide leather trousers, and a red sash, in which was thrust a quiver. Beside him, coiled perhaps as a symbol of power, lay a bosk whip. Kutatuchik absently reached into a small golden box near his right knee and drew out a string of rolled kanda leaf. The roots of the kanda plant, which grows largely in the desert regions on Gor, are extremely toxic. But surprisingly, the rolled leaves of this plant, which are relatively innocuous, are formed into strings and chewed or sucked, are much favored by many Goreans, particularly in the southern hemisphere, where the leaf is more abundant. Kutatuchik, not taking his eyes off of us, thrust an end of the green kanda string in the left side of his mouth, and very slowly began to chew it. He said nothing, nor did Kamchuk. We simply sat near him, cross-legged. I was conscious that only we three on the dais were sitting. I was pleased that there were no prostrations or grovellings involved in approaching the august presence of the exalted Kutatuchik. I gathered that once in his earlier years he might have been a rider of the Kaila, that he might have been skilled with the bow, the lance, and the quiver. Such a man would not need ceremony. I sensed that once this man might have ridden 600 parasangs in a day, living upon a mouthful of water and a handful of bosk meat, kept soft and warm between his saddle and the back of the Kaila. That there might have been few as swift with the quiver, as delicate with the lance as he. That he had known the wars and the winters of the prairie, and that he had met animals and men as enemies and had lived. Such a man did not need ceremony. Such a man, I sensed, was Kutatuchik, called Ubar of the Tuchuks. And yet I was sad as I looked upon him. For I sensed that for this man there could no longer be the saddle of the Kaila, the whirling of the rope and the bola, the hunt and the war. Now from the right side of his mouth, thin, black, and wet, there emerged the chewed string of kanda, a quarter of an inch at a time. Slowly the drooping eyes, glazed, regarded us. For him there could no longer be the swift races across the frozen prairie, the meetings in arms, even the dancing to the sky about a fire of bosk dung. Kamchuk and I waited until the string had been chewed. When Kamchuk had finished it, he held out his right hand, and a man, not a Tuchuk, who wore the green robes of the caste of physicians, thrust in his hand a goblet of bosk horn. It contained a yellow fluid. Angrily, not concealing his distaste, Kutatuchik drained the goblet and then hurled it from him. He then shook himself and regarded Kamchuk. He grinned a Tuchuk grin. "How are the bosk?" he asked. As well as may be expected, said Kamchak. Are the quivers sharp? One tries to keep them so, said Kamchak. It is important to keep the axles of the wagons greased, observed Kudutuchik. Yes, said Kamchak, I believe so. Kudutuchik suddenly reached out. He and Kamchak, laughing, clasped hands. Then Kudutuchik sat back and clapped his hands together sharply twice. Bring the she-slave, he said. I turned to see a stout man step up to the dais, carrying in his arms, folded in the furs of the scarlet lari, a girl. I heard the small sound of a chain. The man-at-arms placed Elizabeth Cardwell before us, and Kudutuchik, and drew away the pelt of the scarlet lari. Elizabeth Cardwell had been cleaned and her hair combed. She was slim and lovely. The man-at-arms arranged her before us. The thick leather collar, I noted, was still sewn about her throat. Elizabeth Cardwell, though she did not know it, knelt before us in the position of the pleasure slave. She looked wildly about and then dropped her head. Aside from the collar on her throat, she, like the other girls on the platform, wore only the surek. Kamchak gestured to me. Speak, I told her. She lifted her head, and then said almost inaudibly, trembling in the restraint of the surek, La Kajira. Then she dropped her head. Kudutuchik seemed satisfied. It is the only Gorian she knows, Kamchak informed. For the time, said Kudutuchik, it is enough. He then looked at the man-at-arms. Have you fed her? He asked. The man nodded. Good, said Kudutuchik. The she-slave will need her strength. The interrogation of Elizabeth Cardwell took hours. Needless to say, I served as translator. The interrogation, to my surprise, was conducted largely by Kamchak rather than Kudutuchik, called Ubar of the Tuchuks. Kamchak's questions were detailed, numerous, and complex. He returned to certain questions at various times, in various ways, connecting subtly her response to one with those of another. He wove a sophisticated net of inquiry about the girl, delicate and fine, and I marveled at his skill. Had there been the least inconsistency, or even hesitation, as though the girl were attempting to recollect or reconcile the details of a fabrication, it would have been detected. During all this time, and torches had been brought, the hours of the night being burned away, Elizabeth Cardwell was not permitted to move, but must needs retain the position of the pleasure slave, knees properly placed, back straight, head high, the gleaming chain of the sirak dangling from the Turian collar, falling to the pelt of the red lari in which she knelt. The translation, as you might expect, was a difficult task, but I attempted to convey as much as I could of what the girl, piteously, the words tumbling out, attempted to tell me. Although there were risks involved, I tried to translate as exactly as I could, letting Miss Cardwell speak as she would, though her words most often have sounded fantastic to the Tuchuks, for it was largely of a world alien to them that she spoke, a world not of autonomous cities but of huge nations, not of castes and crafts, but of global interlocking industrial complexes, not of barter and tarn discs, but a fantastic system of exchange and credit, a world not of tarns, not of the Tharlian, but of aircraft, and motor buses, and trucks, a world in which one's words need not be carried by a lone rider upon the swift Kaila, but could be spread from one corner of the earth to another by leaping through an artificial moon. Kudutuchik and Kamchak, to my pleasure, tended to restrain judgment on these matters. To my gratification, they did not seem to regard the girl as mad. I had been afraid from time to time that they might, losing patience with what must seem to them utter nonsense, order her beaten or impaled. I did not know then, but Kudatuchik and Kamchuk had seen reason for supposing that the girl might be speaking the truth. What they were most interested, of course, and what I was most interested in, namely, how and why the girl came to be wandering upon the plains of Tura in the lands of the wagon peoples. They and I did not learn. We were all at last satisfied that even the girl herself did not know. At last Kamchak had finished, and Kudatuchik too, and they leaned back looking upon the girl. Move no muscle, I said to her, and she did not. She was very beautiful. Kamchak gestured with his head. You may lower your head, I said to the girl, and piteously with a rustle of chain the girl's head and shoulders fell forward, and though she still knelt, her head touched the pelt of the Lhari, her shoulders and back shaking, trembling. It seemed to me, from what I had learned, that there was no particular reason why Elizabeth Cardwell, and not one of Earth's countless others, had been selected to wear the message collar. As yet the collar had not been removed or examined. It was perhaps only that she was convenient, and of course that she was lovely, thus a fitting bearer of the collar, herself a gift with the message to please the Tuchuks, and perhaps better dispose them toward its contents. Miss Cardwell was little different from thousands of lovely working girls in the many great cities of Earth, perhaps more intelligent than few, perhaps prettier than most, but essentially the same. Girls living alone or together in apartments, working in offices, studios, and shops, struggling to earn a living in a glamorous city, whose goods and pleasures they could ill afford to purchase. What had happened to her I might have gathered have happened to any of them. She remembered arising and washing and dressing, eating a hurried breakfast, and taking the elevator downstairs from her apartment, the subway, arriving at work, the routines of the morning as a junior secretary in one of the large advertisement agencies on Madison Avenue, her excitement at being invited to interview for the position of assistant secretary to the head of the art department, her last-minute concern with her lipstick, the hem of her yellow shift, then stenopad in hand, entering his office. With him had been a tall, strange man, broad of shoulder with large hands, a grayish face, eyes almost like glass. He had frightened her. He wore a dark suit of expensive cloth and tailoring, and yet somehow it seemed not that he wore it as one accustomed to such garments. He spoke to her, rather than the man she knew, the head of the department, whom she had seen often. He did not permit her to take the seat by the desk. Rather, he told her to stand and to straighten herself. He seemed to scorn her posture. Angry, she nevertheless did so, until embarrassed, she stood insultingly erect before him. His eyes regarded her ankles with care, then her calves, and she was accurately aware, blushing, that standing as she did, so straight before him, the simple yellow Oxford cloth shift ill-conceived her thighs, the flatness of her belly, the loveliness of your figure. Lift your head, he said, and she did, her chin high, the lovely angry head set proudly upon her aristocratically delicate neck. He then backed away from her. She turned to face him, eyes flashing. Do not speak, he said. Her fingers went white with anger, clutching the sten pad and pencil. He gestured to the far side of the room. Walk there, he said, and return. I will not, she said. Now, said the man. Elizabeth had looked, tears almost in her eyes, at the department head, but he seemed suddenly to her soft, pudgy, distant, sweating, a nothing. He nodded hastily. Please, Miss Cardwell, do as he says. Elizabeth faced that tall, strange man. She was breathing rapidly now. She felt the pencil clutching in her sweating hand, and it broke. "Now," said the man. Looking at him, she suddenly had the feeling, a strange one, that this man, in some circumstances and for some purpose or another, had assessed and judged many women. This infuriated her. It seemed to her a challenge that she would accept. She would show him a woman indeed, allowing herself for the instant to be insolently and fully female, showing him in her walk her contempt and scorn for him. She would then leave and go directly to the personnel office, tending her resignation. She threw back her head. Very well. And Elizabeth Cardwell walked proudly, angrily, to the far side of the room. She wheeled there, faced the man, and approached him, eyes taunting, a smile of contempt playing about her lips. She heard the department head quickly suck in his breath. She did not take her eyes from the tall, strange man. "Are you satisfied?" she asked, quietly, acidly. "Yes," he had said. She remembered then only turning and starting for the door, and a sudden peculiar odor, penetrating, that seemed to close about her face and head. She had regained conscience upon the plains of Gor. She had been dressed precisely as she had been that morning that she had gone to work, save that about her throat she had found sewn a thick, high leather collar. She had cried out. She had wandered. Then, after some hours, stumbling and confused, terrified, hungry through the high brown grass, she had seen two riders, mounted upon swift, strange beasts. They had seen her. She called to them. They approached her cautiously, in a large circle as though examining the grass for enemies, or for others. "I am Elizabeth Cardwell," she had cried. My home is in New York City. What place is this? Where am I?" And then she had seen their faces and had screamed. "Position," said Kamchak. I spoke sharply to the girl. "Be as you were before." Terrified, the girl once more straightened herself, and again, knees placed, back straight, head high, knelt before us in the position of the pleasure slave. "The collar," said Kamchak, "is Taurian." Kurutuchuk nodded. This was news to me, and I welcomed it, for it meant that probably somehow the answer to at least part of the mystery which confronted me lay in the city of Turia. But how was it that Elizabeth Cardwell of Earth wore a Turian message collar? Kamchak drew the quiver from his belt and approached the girl. She looked at him wildly, drawing back. "Do not move," I told her. Kamchuk set the blade of the quiver between the girl's throat and the collar, and moved it. The leather collar seemed to fall from the blade. The girl's neck, where the collar had been sewn, was ready and sweaty, broken out. Kamchuk returned to his place, where he again sat down cross-legged, putting the cut collar on the rug in front of him. I and Kurutuchik watched as he carefully spread open the collar, pressing back two edges. Then from within the collar he drew forth a thin folded piece of paper, wren's paper, made from the fibers of the wren's plant, a tall, long, stalked, leafy plant which grows predominantly in the delta of the Vosk. I suppose in of itself this meant nothing, but I naturally thought of Port Carr, malignant, squalid Port Carr, which claimed suzerainty over the delta, extruding cool tributes from the rents rowers, great stocks of rents paper for trade, sons for oarsmen in cargo galleys, daughters for pleasure slaves in the taverns of the city. I would have expected the message to have been written either on stout, glossy surface linen paper, of the sort milled in R, or perhaps on vellum and parchment, prepared in many cities and used commonly in scrolls. The process involving, among other things, tile washing and lining of skins. They're scraping and stretching, dusting them with shifted chalk, rubbing them down with pumice. Kamchuk handed the paper to Kudatuchik, and he took it, but looked at it. I thought most blankly. Saying nothing, he handed it back to Kamchuk, who seemed to study it with great care, and then, to my amazement, turned it sideways, then upside down. At last he grunted and handed it to me. I was suddenly amused, for it occurred to me that neither of the two chicks could read. Read, said Kudatuchik. I smiled and took the piece of rent paper. I glanced at it, and then I smiled no longer. I could read it, of course. It was in Korean script, moving from left to right, and then from right to left upon the alternating lines. The writing was quite legible. It was written in black ink, probably a reed pen. This again suggested the delta of the Vosk. What does it say? Asked Kudatuchik. The message was simple, consisting of only 3 lines. I read them aloud. Find the man to whom this girl can speak. He is Tarl Cabot. Slay him. And who has signed this message? Said Kudatuchik. I hesitated to read the signature. Well, said Kudatuchik. It is signed, I said, the Priest Kings of Gor. Kudatuchik smiled. You read Korean well, he understood. I understood then that both of them could read, though perhaps many of the two chicks could not. It had been a test. Kamchuk grinned at Kudatuchik, the scarring on his face wrinkling with pleasure. He has held grass and earth with me, he said. Ah, said Kudatuchik, I did not know. My mind was whirling. Now I understood, as I had only suspected before, why any English-speaking girl was necessary to bear this collar, that she might be the device whereby I would be singled out from the hundreds and thousands among the wagons, and so be marked for death. But I could not understand why Priest King should wish me slain. Was I not engaged, in a sense, upon their work? Had I not come to the wagon peoples upon their behalf, to search for the doubtless golden spear that was the last egg of Priest Kings, the final hope of their race? Now they wished me to die. It did not seem possible. I prepared to fight for my life, selling it as dearly as possible upon the dais of Kudatuchik, called the Ubar of the Tuchuks. For what Korean would dare reject the command of the Priest Kings? I stood up and unsheathed my sword. 1 or 2 of the men-at-arms immediately drew their quiver. A small smile touched the broad face of Kudatuchik. Put your sword away and sit down, said Kamchuk. Dumbfounded, I did so. It is, said Kamchuk, obviously not a message of Priest Kings. How would you know? I asked. The scarred face wrinkled again, and Kamchuk rocked back and slapped his knees. He laughed. Do you think Priest Kings, if they wished you dead, would ask others to do this for them? He pointed at the open collar lying before him on the rug. Do you think Priest Kings would use a Turin message collar? He pointed his broad finger at Elizabeth Cardwell. Do you think Priest Kings need a girl to find you? Kamchuk threw back his head. He laughed loudly, and even Kudatuchik smiled. No, said Kamchuk, slapping his knees. Priest Kings do not need 2 chicks to do their killing. What Kamchuk had said then seemed to make a great deal of sense to me, yet it seemed strange that anyone, no matter whom, would dare to use the name of the Priest Kings falsely. Who or what could dare to do such a thing? Besides, how did I know that the message was not from Priest Kings? I knew, as Kamchuk and Kudatuchik did not, of the recent nest war beneath the Sadar, and of the disruptions in the technological complexes of the nest. Who knew to what primitive devices priest kings might now find themselves reduced? Yet, on the whole, I did tend to agree with Komchak that it was not likely that the message came from priest kings. It had been, after all, months at the nest war, and surely by now, to some extent, priest kings would have managed to restore a significant portion of the equipment, devices of surveillance and control, by means of which they had, for such long millennia, managed to maintain their mastery of this barbarian sphere. Besides this, as far as I knew, Misk, who was my friend, and between whom and myself there was nest trust, was still the highest born of the living priest kings, and the final authority in matters of importance in the nest. I knew that Misk, if no other, would not have wished for my death. And finally I reminded myself again, was I now not engaged in their work? Was I not now attempted to be of service to them? Was I not now among the wagon peoples, in peril perhaps upon their behalf? But I also asked myself, if this message was not from priest kings, from who could it be? For who would dare this? And who but priest kings would know that I was among the wagon peoples? And yet I told myself, someone or something must know. Others who were not priest kings. There must be others. Others who did not wish me to succeed in my work. Who wished priest kings or the race to die. Others who were capable even of bringing human forms earth for this purpose. Technology advanced. Others who were. Perhaps I cautiously and invisibly at war with priest kings, who perhaps wished at prize this world, or perhaps this world and earth as well, our sun and its planets. Others who perhaps stood upon the margins of our system, waiting perhaps for the demise of the power of the priest kings, perhaps the shield which unknown to men had protect them perhaps from the time of the first grasping of stones, from the time perhaps even an intelligent prehensile animal could build fires in the mouth of its lair. But these speculations were too fantastic, and I dismissed them. There was remaining, however, a mystery, and I was determined to resolve it. The answer possibly lay in Tura. In the meantime, I would, of course, continue my work. I would try for Misk to find that egg, and return it to the Sadar. I suspected, truly as it turned out, that the mystery and my mission were not utterly unconnected. What, asked Kamchak, would you do if you thought the message were truly from Peace Kings? Nothing, said Kamchak gravely. You would risk, I asked, the herds, the wagons, the peoples? Both Kamchak and I do. That priest kings were not lightly to be disobeyed. Their vengeance could extend to the total and complete annihilation of very cities. Indeed, their power, as I knew, was sufficient to destroy the very planets. Yes, said Kamchak. Why, I asked. He looked at me and smiled. Because, said he, we have together held grass and earth. Kudituchik, Kamchak, and I then regarded Elizabeth Cardwell. I knew that as far as the interrogation was concerned, she had served her purpose. There was nothing more to be learned from her, and she too must have sensed this, for she seemed, though she did not move, terribly frightened. Her fear could be read in her eyes, in the slight tremulous movement of her lower lip. In the affairs of state she was now without value. Then, uncontrollably, piteously, suddenly, trembling in the cirque, she put her head down to the pelt of the Lhari. Please, she said, do not kill me. I translated for Kuchuk and Kudituchik. Kudituchik addressed the question to her. Are you zealous to please the fancy of Tuchuks? I translated. and with horror Elizabeth Cardwell lifted her head from the pelt and regarded her captors. She shook her head wildly. "No, please, no." "Impale her," said Kudatuchik. Two warriors moved forward and seized the girl under her arms, lifting her from the pelt. "What are they going to do?" she cried. "They intend to impale you," I told her. She began to scream, "Please, please, please." My hand was on the hilt of my sword, but Kamchak's hand rested upon mine. Kamchak turned to Kudatuchik. "She seems zealous." Once again, Kudatuchik addressed this question to her, and I translated. "Are you zealous to please the fancy of the Tuchuks?" The men who held the girl allowed her to fall to her knees between them. "Yes," she said piteously, "yes." Kudatuchik, Kamchuk, and I regarded her. "Yes," she wept, her head to the rug. "I am zealous to please the fancy of the Tuchuks." I translated for Kudatuchik and Kamchuk. "Ask," demanded Kudatuchik, "if she begs to be a slave girl." I translated the question. "Yes," wept Elizabeth Cardwell. "Yes, I beg to be a slave girl." Perhaps in that moment Elizabeth Cardwell recalled the strange man, so fearsome, grey of face with eyes like glass, who had so examined her upon earth, before whom she had stood as though upon a block, unknowingly being examined for her fitness to bear the message collar of Turia. How she had challenged him, how she had walked, how insolent she had been. Perhaps in that moment she thought how amused the man might be if he could see her now, that proud girl, now in the Cyric, her head to the pelt of Alari, kneeling to barbarians, begging to be a slave girl. And if she had thought of these things, how she might have then cried out in her heart, for she would have then recognized that the man would have known full well what lay in store for her. How he must have laughed within himself at her petty show of female pride, her vanity, knowing it was this for which the lovely brown-haired girl in the yellow shift was destined. "I grant her wish," said Kudatuchik. Then to a warrior nearby he said, "Bring me meat." The warrior leapt from the dais, and in a few moments returned with a handful of roasted bosk meat. Kudatuchik gestured for the girl, trembling, to be brought forward, and the two warriors brought her to him, placing her directly before him. He took the meat in his hand and gave it to Kamchak, who bit into it, a bit of juice running to the side of his mouth. Kamchak then held the meat to the girl. "Eat," I told her. Elizabeth Cardwell took the meat in her two hands, confined before her by slave bracelets and the chain of the Cyric. Then bending her head, the hair falling forward, she ate it. She, a slave, had accepted meat from the hands of the Kamchuk of the Tuchuks. She belonged to them now. "La Kajira," she said, putting her head down, then covering her face with her manacled hands. She wept.